This is BBC One at 9 o'clock and the BBC News with Peter Sissons.
Desperate hours in East Timor, poised on the brink of civil war. Rejecting democracy, militiamen run riot and the UN is helpless. William Hague accuses Tony Blair of betraying the people of Northern Ireland. And scientists make super mouse. Could they now hold the key to boosting human intelligence? Good evening. East Timor is gripped by fear and chaos tonight as armed militiamen, with the apparent connivance of Indonesian troops, show what they think of democracy. On the streets, there's murder and panic, and unarmed United Nations officials who've supervised this week's referendum were pinned down in their own compound. The legacy of violence in East Timor dates from Indonesia's invasion in 1975, aimed at preventing a left-wing independence group seizing power after the Portuguese pulled out. 250,000 people are estimated to have died in the repression that followed. But the East Timorese never gave up, and Monday's referendum is thought to have produced a huge vote in support of independence. Matt Fry reports from Dili, the capital of East Timor.
An afternoon in Dili. Time for war. A dirty war. These were pro-independence supporters setting up barricades to defend their neighborhood from anti-independence militia. Theoretically, their dispute is about whether East Timor should belong to Indonesia. In practice, they like to kill each other. Watch the man getting hit by the rifle. He supports independence, but not the men chasing him with machetes. Fresh from their kill, the militias now turn their attention to us journalists. We were trapped, and the person being beaten is my BBC colleague, Jonathan Head. He was lucky to get away with a few bruises. This attack was unusual because it took place outside the UN compound. With the militia on our heels, cameraman Darren Conway and I ran to take refuge.
Hurry up. Back from the gate now. Out. Back now.
Having set fire to nearby houses, the militia surrounded the UN headquarters. They hate the organization for presiding over the referendum on independence, and the UN is at their mercy.
Unimet staff, please move into the auditorium. There are people on the hill with guns. We don't need you outside.
The only protection comes from the Indonesian police. There are thousands of them. They could easily control the militia, but they don't. It took them a whole hour to get here. By now, hundreds of civilians were streaming into the compound, desperate for sanctuary. Only 2 days after their first ever taste of democracy, these people faced the abyss once again. Those who'd made it in were now trying to get their relatives down from the hills. But that meant running the gauntlet of militia gunfire. In their yearning for independence from Indonesia, these people pose a threat to the rest of this vast country. The fear is that if they break loose, it may trigger the nation's unraveling. One reason, perhaps, why the Indonesian authorities are doing so little.
Tonight, the UN mission in East Timor is well and truly under siege. There are militia gunmen in the hills just outside here, shooting at the compound, and this room, which we normally use for press conferences, has been turned into a refugee camp.
While the refugees stayed behind, we were taken in a police truck to our hotel, past the militia roadblocks, through a city under siege, in a country on the brink of civil war. At the port, we found hundreds of people trying to leave by boat, any boat. These are mainly settlers from other parts of Indonesia, now too frightened to stay. This family took everything, including the kitchen sink. Some of them have come from islands now also striving for independence. They're a reminder that what's at stake in East Timor is not just the liberty of one people, but the breakup of the world's fourth most populous nation. Matt Fry, BBC News, Dili.
William Hague has launched his strongest attack so far on the government over Northern Ireland. He's accused Tony Blair of betraying the trust of the people there by continuing to release terrorist prisoners and not acknowledging there have been serious breaches of the ceasefire. Downing Street said his comments were unhelpful. And the Northern Ireland Secretary, Mo Mowlam, urged the Ulster Unionists and Sinn Féin not to boycott next week's review of the Good Friday Agreement.
Northern Ireland Secretary Mo Mowlam chose the children's first day back at Ulidia School in Carrickfergus, attended by Catholics and Protestants, to appeal to Northern Ireland's parties today to keep the troubled peace process going. She defended her insistence that the paramilitary ceasefire was holding, despite recent killings and beatings.
What we're doing is not about appeasement, not turning a blind eye, but trying to help this society end its historic conflict. And I believe that the basic desire is still there, despite all the recent problems. And that is why the parties should be in there talking to each other in the Mitchell Review next week and not walking away.
She hit back at Tory leader William Hague's accusation the government had betrayed the people by continuing to release terrorist prisoners.
I believe that bipartisanship has been an important part of this process, and it's disappointing if they appear to be backing off from that. I don't think that will help the process at all.
Since John Major started the peace process, Labour and the Tories have cooperated. Ministers are angry the Tories seem to be backing away now, despite their help when Labour might have toppled Mr Major's government over Northern Ireland. Mr Hague counters that he wants the Good Friday Agreement to work, but has the right to criticise over broken promises.
When people say to me, you shouldn't raise this, you shouldn't be talking about this, I say, look, there are people being killed, maimed, beaten, shot, driven out of the country, and we are not meant to mention it. They're kidding. You've got to be kidding. Of course we mention it. It's the duty of an opposition to do so.
Mr Hague insists he's not walking away from the bipartisan policy on Northern Ireland, but his talk of betrayal has angered the Prime Minister. In a Times article tomorrow, Mr Blair says some Tories don't believe in the peace process and want it to fail. He accuses Mr Hague of being ready to pull it to bits. Cross-party cooperation is hanging by a thread. Robin Oakley, BBC News at Conservative Central Office.
Within the last hour, rescue workers in Turkey have all but given up hope of finding a survivor trapped under the rubble from last month's devastating earthquake. Earlier in the day, there'd been growing optimism that someone might still be alive 15 days after the quake, when rescue dogs indicated possible signs of life in the basement of a collapsed 5-storey building in the city of Goljuk. Rescue teams worked into the darkness to reach the basement, but they now say they found no obvious signs of life. A number of parents whose babies were used in experimental trials have told the police that their signatures on the forms that gave their consent were forged. An independent inquiry is already underway into the deaths of 28 babies involved in the tests. North Staffordshire Hospital says its procedures were in line with national guidelines.
6-year-old Stephen Bradley has the mental age of a baby. He's unable to speak or properly coordinate his movements. Stephen's mother blames his condition on the ventilator doctors used to treat him when he was born 6 weeks premature. The so-called CNEP was being trialled at the North Staffordshire Hospital, so doctors needed parents' informed consent. In other words, a form needed to be signed. Sharon Bradley and at least 3 other parents say they never put their signature to anything.
This is a consent form that the hospital produced. It's a forgery. I didn't sign this. My name is Sharon and this looks like D.L. Bradley. I aren't sure of the initials, but that's what it looks like. Stephen's father's name's John Myatt. He didn't sign it, as you can see. As far as I'm concerned, they forged this.
And Sharon Bradley isn't alone. Gloria Brown's son Joshua died at 6 days old. He'd been treated on the CNEP ventilator after being born premature in 1992. But his mother says she refused to be part of the trial.
They fraudulently put my signature there. I did not sign that form. I would not have signed that form, as I did not want him moving.
The CNEP trial was being run by Professor David Southall, a well-respected paediatrician, although it wasn't his job to secure consent from patients. Hospital managers today declined an interview, saying it would be inappropriate to comment until the publication of the inquiry into the trial. But in a written statement issued by the hospital trust today, a spokeswoman said the information given to parents about the study and the procedures for obtaining their consent were fully in line with national guidelines for research involving children. But the way data was collected during the ventilator trial also worries parents. The data form for this couple's previous baby, Joshua, gives him a high score because he didn't need oxygen at the age of 28 days. In fact, by that stage, he was already dead.
You never really know what's going on in these places, you know. Obviously you put your entire trust and well-being in their hands and you think, you know, I'm in the best place, but, well, are you really at the end of the day?
The inquiry into the ventilator trial is expected to land on ministers' desks within a month. Andrew Tomlinson, BBC News, Stoke-on-Trent.
Britain's biggest mortgage lender, the Halifax, will publish a survey tomorrow showing the house prices are rising at their fastest rate for 10 years. Figures from the Bank of England have already shown a record surge in consumer borrowing, and others are indicating an upturn too in the fortunes of manufacturers. It's all prompted talk of a boom in the economy, with the next move in interest rates being up.
For the first time since 1967, registration letters are changing twice this year. But sales of the new V-Reg cars don't seem to be suffering at all from the fact that the new T-Reg cars were out only 6 months ago. Henry Nothman's taking delivery of his new Honda 4x4. Interest rates are so low, it doesn't seem sensible to leave the money in the bank.
The return on the cash is very low, and therefore, if you have the cash available, you might as well buy something that you enjoy using.
Car sales aren't exactly booming, but the industry has revised up its estimate of how many will be sold this year. The good news for car dealers is that people are feeling much more confident about the future. A year ago, it seemed that we were on the brink of recession, but we didn't have a recession, although we did have quite a sharp slowdown. And now, the economy is powering ahead again. Even manufacturing's now showing signs of a revival. Export markets are picking up in Europe and in Asia, and sales at home are rising too. The Honda factory here in Swindon is planning a big expansion. It's hiring another 1,000 people next year.
We're just announced and started the development of a new factory on the Swindon site. Current production's just on 120,000, and just over 2 years' time it'll be 250,000 cars, producing a full range of motor cars, and that'll result in 3/4 of the cars that we'll be selling in the UK will be built in the UK.
Honda's one of the employers that's made Swindon one of Britain's most successful towns. Unemployment here is just 2%. And house prices have risen 15% in a year. But though the average UK price rise is higher than it's been for a decade, it's still some way short of the levels seen in the 1980s boom. In 1988 and 89, prices soared. But then came the crash, and for much of the 1990s, prices were flat or falling. Though they are now picking up, the price rises seen today are still way short of the spectacular gains seen 10 years ago.
Swindon happens to be a particular growth area, but it's patchy across the rest of the UK. And there's a big difference this time because people's employment prospects are very much better and the economy is much more stable. And with inflation low, I don't think there's any real prospect of a boom-bust cycle such as we saw in the late 80s.
And with prices in the high street still very subdued, an inflationary boom still seems a long way off. And for now, the outlook for the economy looks good. Ed Crooks, BBC News.
Intense negotiations are underway tonight, signalling a possible breakthrough in the Middle East peace process. The talks have been deadlocked for 8 months over the issue of Palestinian prisoner releases. The US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, is due in Egypt in the morning, where it's hoped she'll preside over a deal to implement last year's Y Land for Security peace accord.
Diplomatic grace masked deep tensions earlier today as the Israelis and Palestinians tried to broker a deal. Under severe pressure, the two sides almost gave up. A special envoy from the Israeli Prime Minister stepped in just hours ago. Now an agreement could be in the offing.
The gap between us and the Palestinians is very, very narrow. We did most of the work.
Right-wing Israelis took to the streets today to protest at the government's moves towards peace, putting added pressure on the government not to give in. The peace deal hinges now on the fate of just 50 political prisoners, whom the Palestinians want freed. A poignant reminder of why the issue is so deeply controversial. The bodies of two lovers killed on Monday. The day that a peace deal is in the offing, the Islamic fundamentalist group Hamas has claimed responsibility. This leaflet from the extremists says the killing was part of their struggle to end the peace process. In Jordan this week, Hamas offices were closed down as part of the regional effort to move towards peace. The militants have now responded, saying they'll attack Jewish targets worldwide. Palestinian patrols like this hunt down Hamas activists every day, claiming that they control the streets, but the struggle is still very much alive.
Our priority is to resist the occupation until we liberate our land and our people. The new Israeli government is our enemy.
Against this backdrop, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright arrived in Morocco today. She could preside over the signing of a new peace deal in Egypt tomorrow. That is, if all goes to plan. Tonight may bring a deal which ends 8 months of deadlock in the Middle East peace process. And the new threat of violence steps up the pressure for an agreement. For if one isn't reached now, an historic opportunity could be missed. Hilary Anderson, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Air investigators in Argentina have recovered the flight recorder from the wreckage of an airliner which crashed on takeoff from an airport in Buenos Aires. Up to 80 people were killed when the Boeing 737 skidded off the runway, hitting cars on a busy road before bursting into flames on a golf course. About 20 people on the plane survived. Russia's Federal Security Service says a homemade device caused the explosion at a Moscow shopping centre next to the Kremlin. The government has promised to find those responsible for the bomb attack, which injured 41 people, including several children. 24 of the injured are still in hospital. The future of some of England's most prestigious grammar schools could be in doubt if parents vote to change their status. From today, campaigners wanting to end selective entry to grammar schools can start to collect parents' signatures, which could trigger a ballot on the school's future.
You only get to come to this school if you're particularly bright. Queen Elizabeth's in North London is one of 164 grammar schools remaining in England.
At this school, you chaps will find a very great deal of opportunity.
95% of pupils here get at least 5 top-grade GCSEs.
There are children of ability who don't have their needs met sufficiently across the community. That is why there is such a demand for schools such as this. This school meets those demands.
But some grammar schools may in future be forced to admit children of all abilities. Officially, ministers want to see an end to academic selection, but they don't want to be seen to be getting rid of successful schools. That's why grammar schools present such a tricky problem for New Labour. Their solution has been to let someone else take the difficult decisions, parents. From today, campaigners who oppose selection can start collecting signatures from parents who want a ballot on whether the local grammar school should continue to select its pupils.
We believe that children do better when they're not selected at 11, that we don't divide children up into successes and failures at 11. Of course, the schools are needed and the schools will remain, and what parents eventually, if there are ballots, parents will be asked is to decide whether their local grammar schools admit children of all abilities.
The future of every grammar school will be decided in individual local battles. It's impossible to predict how many communities will want to end this particular tradition in English education. Sue Littlemore, BBC News.
Members of the Scottish Parliament have returned to work in Edinburgh after a 2-month break. They've faced heavy criticism from Scottish voters for not doing enough and taking too much holiday.
An infant for a fledgling parliament. Scotland's First Minister presents medals to babies born on July the 1st, the day the parliament took power. But that transfer of power has been accompanied by a series of controversies, and even today a row over the commemorative medals for members, costing £7,000 in total. The First Minister dismisses complaints.
So far as I'm concerned, we're just getting down to work, and the best way of putting a good face on the Parliament is not to strive for presentational factors, but just get down to the job that we're supposed to be doing, which is representing Scottish interests and dealing with Scottish priorities.
But as the incoming mail piles up at the Parliament's post office, the opinion of the Scottish public is divided, with critics no doubt influenced by early claims that the Parliament cost too much and spent too long on its summer holiday.
They're doing nothing. They're just playing it, being a Parliament.
You really need to get their act together, I think. I mean, I think it's just a bit of a club, in fact.
They haven't been in for a very long time, so they must be given a chance.
This afternoon there was political heat in the chamber.
For the health of the people of Scotland. For 18 years we saw
And substance too, a debate on new initiatives to tackle Scotland's dreadful public health record. And also today, publication of a government bill to close a loophole which freed a killer from Scotland's state mental hospital, plus a backbench bill to ban fox hunting, which stands a strong chance of becoming law, by contrast with efforts in England and Wales. MSPs say judge us on all that and other measures on the way to reform the law of Scotland. They know the Parliament suffered short-term damage, but insist that longer-term hard work on behalf of the people of Scotland will make amends. Brian Taylor, BBC News, Edinburgh.
Libya is celebrating the 30th anniversary of its revolution, the one that brought Colonel Gaddafi to power. The country had seen the celebrations as an opportunity to strengthen its ties with the outside world after years of isolation. But as our World Affairs editor John Simpson reports from Tripoli, the festivities have been remarkably muted.
For once, there's something to celebrate. The 30th anniversary of a revolution which only a minority of the population even remembers has come at the time when 15 years of sanctions on Libya have been lifted. There's nationwide relief. Things are definitely changing here. Colonel Gaddafi used to be the great enthusiast for Arab unity. Now the emphasis is all on African unity. There are occasional reminders even now of the old days of revolutionary chic, but that's a thing of the past. Colonel Gaddafi cuts a different figure nowadays. He's milder and vaguer. On a television phone-in about the revolution, the questions sent into the studio moderator were pretty easy, and his answers sometimes lasted half an hour. But his new guru is Nelson Mandela, peace and reconciliation, South African style. The changes have gone down well. In the past, Colonel Gaddafi tried to shut down private businesses, and shopkeepers would tell you secretly how much they hated him. Now they're far more supportive, and not only when they know people are watching.
At the moment now, I think the Libyans, more open, all the Arab countries, all the Africans, they like this country.
Now there are rich pickings here. Britain was quick to restore relations last month, and even during sanctions it was Libya's third largest supplier. Quietly, the British always kept the relationship going with Tripoli, even during the worst times. Libya's murder of police officer Yvonne Fletcher in London, for instance, and the Lockerbie bombing.
We've got foundations, and we will build on those foundations. Those foundations are strong, and in the coming months there will be, yes, trade delegations coming out, and we will look to expand the relationship so that the unfortunate incidents of the past are never repeated.
There was a time when Muammar al-Gaddafi seemed just about the least likely figure on earth for Western countries to think of getting close to. But Libya's vast supplies of oil help, of course, and he and his revolution have mellowed over time. Even so, this remains a pretty eccentric kind of country after all these years. John Simpson, BBC News, Tripoli.
Scientists at Princeton University in America have used genetic engineering to create the world's first super-intelligent mouse. Their aim is to understand the complex brain chemistry that underlies memory and intelligence. Tonight's the world's leading researcher into genes, how genes affect human intelligence, told the 9 o'clock news that their results show how our own memories might one day be improved.
This is Doogie, the super mouse, the first animal to have been genetically engineered to be more intelligent. He's one of dozens of mice that are able to outperform ordinary mice in simple memory and learning tests. Scientists achieved this by making part of their brain more efficient. Animal brains are made of billions of nerve cells. At birth, very few are connected together. But as we learn, links begin to form, creating a network, rather like a telephone system. This is a highly magnified picture of where two nerve cells meet. Our nerves transmit a message when chemicals are sent across a tiny gap between them, but only when a gate on the receiving cell is open. In Doogie's case, a gene has been changed to keep this gate open for longer. This increases the chance of a permanent link, effectively a memory being formed.
We have identified a critical molecular switch which controls learning and memory, which also may explain why there is age-dependent memory loss in normal animals. Those findings may help us to further identify the other machineries, as well as come up with a promising strategy to treat the memory and the learning disabilities.
Robert Plomin is currently comparing the genes of super bright children with ordinary ones to see if there are any differences. Once we showed him the mouse research, he immediately emailed the Princeton team and asked them to help him to see if the gene they've discovered would affect the intelligence in people.
It has such far-reaching implications, and that always creates problems as well. But my feeling is, viva la problems. We want to have findings that are big and important and make us rethink things like biological enhancement of our lives.
Although there are some worries that the technology could be abused, scientists say that it'll give a more detailed understanding of the inner workings of the brain, and the work could in time lead to better treatments for many severe brain disorders. Palab Ghosh, BBC News.
And the main news tonight, it's feared East Timor may be on the brink of civil war as anti-independence militiamen run riot on the streets of the capital. That's all from the 9 o'clock news. Good night.
Good evening. A 27-year-old man has been charged with murder and theft of a motor vehicle following an accident in which a Manchester policeman was killed. Stephen Lee Draper, who's 27, of no fixed address, is due to appear before Manchester magistrates tomorrow morning. Police Constable Bashart Raja Ahmed was killed when he was flung from his motorcycle on the Allen Turing Way yesterday. 2 Liverpool teenagers were today banned from entering parts of the city. The 17-year-olds, who can't be named for legal reasons, had vandalised, spat and urinated in the area. They're the first in the country to be served with antisocial behaviour orders under new laws introduced as part of the Crime and Disorder Act. Our Home Affairs correspondent Michelle Clifford reports.
This street and another close by will be strictly out of bounds for the 2 17-year-olds at the centre of today's court action. If they come here, they'll be committing a criminal offence and could face up to 5 years in jail. Liverpool City Council had asked for antisocial behaviour orders to limit the movements and activities of the teenagers after secretly filming them jumping on cars, urinating in the street and throwing missiles. 6 orders were granted.
They are the bad guys and we're not going to let them win. This is a victory for the good guys of Liverpool. We want people to be able to live in their streets in peace and quiet and have a reasonable standard of life, which isn't going to be threatened by a very small minority.
Stipendiary Magistrate David Tapp told the teenagers that everyone had a right to a quiet life and it was necessary to restrict their movements to protect others. He reminded them of the seriousness of breaking the orders, saying, at 17 you are nearly men, you must behave like men.
A teenager from Bolton has been jailed for nearly 4 years after admitting conspiracy to supply heroin. 19-year-old Craig Fowler from Heaton Avenue in Little Lever was described by the judge at Preston Crown Court as the main link in heroin supply between Manchester and Cumbria. More than 60 children from Manchester were withdrawn from school by their parents today in protest at a planned merger. The group is opposed to a scheme to close 3 Catholic secondary schools and open a new one in its place. They say they'd rather organise their own education. Eleanor Moritz reports.
Where do you want to stay?
St Albans! Parents brought their children to the gates of the newly named St Peter's Roman Catholic High School in Gorton, but they weren't here for lessons. Letters were handed in withdrawing the pupils from school. They're opposed to plans to merge 3 schools into one because of falling pupil numbers and a £1 million deficit.
The disturbance of being moved from 3 different schools, year 10 and 11 pupils, and being put together is bound to cause disruption to their education.
It's not fair for them to move us and jeopardise my future just because they want to get more money.
The parents plan to organise temporary classes. The Education Authority wants to encourage the children back into formal education.
That's it. In North West Tonight tomorrow evening, we'll be looking at plans to restore the Victoria Baths in Manchester. In their day, the biggest public baths of their kind in the country. That's on BBC One at 6:30. We're back in Breakfast News tomorrow. Meanwhile, here's Isabel Lang.
Hello there, good evening. Well, there was too much cloud for the high temperatures we hoped for in eastern Scotland, but there was some warmth around. And this afternoon it was Gravesend and Southampton that peaked at 26 Celsius, that's 79 Fahrenheit. Now, over the next few days, I think we can expect rather more widespread warmth. The deep oranges and reds really taking hold. That's temperatures over around 25 or 26 Celsius, and they'll last right on into the start of next week. Well, this is the waving front then that's kept things rather cloudy across northwestern parts of Britain, feeding a lot of mist and moisture, quite strong winds as well. And you can see this little wave on the front here. That's actually going to start to head in towards northwest Scotland through tonight. That'll pep up the rain and drizzle, also bring a little bit of drizzly rain into Northern Ireland as well. It'll also pep up the winds, so we could even see gales for a time across the Northern and Western Isles. Further south though, under high pressure, it'll be fine. There'll be some mist and fog, and here cooler really at around 10 or 11 degrees. But the mist shouldn't cause too much of a problem tomorrow morning, clearing quite quickly. Then a lot of sunshine for England and Wales tomorrow. And even though there'll be cloud further north through the morning, I think some brighter skies for Northern Ireland, particularly for Armagh and Down. Also southern and eastern Scotland through the afternoon, a brighter picture than today. Still the drizzly rain hanging on in the northwest though. Still quite blustery in the northwest, temperatures around 18 for the Western Isles. The highest temperatures really more widespread though for England and Wales at around 26, possibly 27 Celsius. Now that waving front starting to make inroads in the northwest during Friday, so we will see a band of cloud pushing in across Scotland, particularly western Scotland and Northern Ireland, so some drizzly rain there. Elsewhere though, fine, sunny and hotter, 27, possibly 28 Celsius in the odd spot. That's getting up into the low 80s, so it really is quite warm for this time of year. During Saturday though, the front really quite a weak affair as it pushes its way in across Scotland, and then through Sunday really many of us enjoying some fine weather, quite a lot of sunshine. Possibly though, the odd shower in the southeast. Bye-bye.